Well, good morning, and thank you for being here for our next session. This is a panel devoted to the social lives of secrets, concealment, and control of information. I would like to introduce the first speaker of two for this panel. We will take, as before, we will take questions after both our speakers have presented their papers. Our first speaker is Professor Benedek Láng from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. He will be speaking on the very interesting topic of Beyond Encryption, the social history of secrecy and cryptography in early modern Europe.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation to this wonderful conference. What follows is the story of my intellectual development over the last 15 years. It's a very rich story. I have 42 slides, so I'm going to speak very quickly. First, I tell you what I decided to do like 15 years ago, the research program I wanted to follow, and then in the second part I will explain what I actually did. So basically, if I find it, I argued back then, that in traditional history of science, well, this was not an original argument, I just need to start it from somewhere. In traditional history of science, authors usually concentrate on the great authors like Kepler, Copernicus, Aristotle, the basic disciplines like mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and the key concepts like scientia, experientia, the scientific revolution, and so on and so forth. However, in the 1980s and 90s, new authors, new books have been published. I have somewhere, here we have William Emon, for example, and new topics emerged. There was a growing interest in everyday people and in everyday scenes, for example, besides the university and the academia, sites of knowledge production such as the market, the square, the village, the library, the classroom, the botanical garden, and so on and so forth were also discussed. And besides the basic and important notions, such as experimentation, and so on, the evidence, persuasion as a practice, and also secrecy became central topic for historians of science. So this is secrecy from where we start now. If you read the publications on the growing amount of publications on secrecy. Secrecy also has a journal, for example, and many monographs, articles, books, everything. There are many topics covered in these publications: secret knowledge, secrets in science, books of secrets, medical secrets, sexual secrets. But I argued that somehow the primary means of secrecy, secret writing, is sort of missing from these publications. On the other hand, cryptography, history of ciphers, also have a growing literature with its journal, basic authors, and articles. But there is again a problem, namely that this literature is very much internalistic. In history of science, as most of you know, internalistic means that authors concentrate on the basic concepts, on the basic methods, on the basic authors, everything that is still relevant. And externalistic means that some authors would concentrate more on the social context. And this externalist approach is kind of missing in the publication on ciphers. So not only cryptography is not really treated in its social context, but also this secrecy literature, which I just showed you very quickly, is sort of ignored in the literature of cryptography. So I wanted to join the two, and I wanted to pay more attention to the social context beyond diplomacy, because ciphers, cryptography in diplomacy is very well discussed and researched. But how are ciphers used in religion, science, in the artisanal tradition, in engineering, in the general university context, and in the private life of everyday people? What are the attitudes of the users to cryptography, to the ciphers? How much trust do they lay in using the ciphers? How much are they afraid of revealing their secrets? What do they want to hide? What content do they want to hide, and what content they don't hide in a specific message in a letter? How are political and private encryption related to each other? And if we want to follow this internalistic approach towards cryptography, even then there are so many questions which haven't yet been really asked. How are the cipher keys exchanged? If I want to exchange encrypted messages with you, first we have to agree upon a specific cipher key. How was that exchanged? How frequently were these cipher keys changed, replaced? What security measures were taken, and how were the keys protected? Who was the encryptor, the scribe or the prince himself, who was actually changing messages with someone? And knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is a field which is by definition secretive, where you don't want to transfer your knowledge. How did following generations get the knowledge from the previous one? Was there any knowledge transfer or not? So these were my questions. My aim was to study cryptography in the context of its application in a wide range of social milieus, and besides the localized sources like diplomatic sources related to conspiracy, espionage, spies, there are so many other sources which are completely dispersed. University handbooks, private diaries, religious texts, and private correspondence, and many other sources which are not that easy to localize. Research questions, I already mentioned quite a few of them. What are the relations of practices of intentional secrecy and cryptography? So other fields of secrecy and cryptography. In an encrypted message, what is encrypted and what is left as a clear text that can be read easily? How widespread the cryptographic methods were beyond the field of diplomacy, how much trust was laid in these methods, what was the purpose of encryption. You would say to hide the content, but is it really true? Is it always hiding the content? Sometimes we encrypt something because we want to invite your interest. Here there is something which is exciting, you want to solve it, and it's easily solvable, so it's not always hiding the text. What were the practitioner attitudes towards this technology that they were used? Why did certain diaries, private diaries, use certain ciphers which were very easily to solve? What were the typical mistakes? How did they try to protect the keys? I already mentioned all this. And to paraphrase, to use a paraphrase from Jacques Le Goff, what did the university student, the emperor's clerk, and the master of the mint have in common as far as their attitudes to and practices of cryptography were concerned? Okay, so what did I actually do? I went to the archives. And I arrived to this Láng conjecture. If you want to be cited and remembered, you should have a theory and name this theory after your own name, because then you will become famous. This Láng conjecture is the following. If you go to the archives, 1% of the material will be partly or fully enciphered. Is this little? Is this a lot? It's actually a lot. It means, well, there's huge amount of archival materials, like charters, diaries, letters, private and diplomatic correspondence. If you go to the library and 1 out of 100 letters will be relevant for cryptography, it's a huge amount of source, actually. And no one has ever refuted this Láng conjecture, so please cite it and agree with it. But if you want to debate it, that's also fine, because it's also a citation. Okay. They are easy to recognize, but they are not easy to locate. Cipher keys are very well structured, not always that beautiful, but sometimes beautiful documents. And enciphered texts are also easy to recognize. You have graphic symbols or numbers in a letter. And very often they are solved actually. I don't want to frustrate you, but most of the cryptographic sources are solved because the actual addressee wrote the solution above or below the lines. So it's easy to find them. No, it's easy to recognize them, but it's not easy to find them. You should know where to look for them in the archives and in the manuscript reading rooms. I put together a huge database. I rather concentrated at that time on Central Europe, but later we expanded the whole research for whole Europe. It was a big database containing cipher keys and cipher documents and mentionings of the ciphering practice, because that was also very interesting for me, how people talk about it and what they actually say that they do. We put together a cipher cracking program, which sounds very easy, but it's not that easy. Why is it not easy? Because if you want to break historical ciphers, you need linguistic corpora. It's very easy to break, well, these are outdated methods, right? We are talking about the late Middle Ages and the early modern times. Of course, they are outdated. They are not easy to solve. They're not easy to solve, and you need relevant historical corpora. It's very easy to solve a cipher, which is in present-day English. You just put it in well, anywhere, in Google and ChatGPT, and it will solve very quickly. But if it is in like 16th century French, then the variations, linguistic variations, the actual state of that language really matters. So you need linguistic corpora in diplomatic, not like in edited form, but in diplomatic spelling. Okay, so we put together something like that. Then I argued that I should write a whole monograph on this. And what really happened is that I realized that even earlier, when I was still dealing with medieval magic, I was already interested in ciphers, because these medieval university students and professors who were interested in astrology and image magic, talismanic magic, they used ciphers, and apparently they used very simple methods, which were really good just to advertise that, look, here I'm doing something really somewhat forbidden, but not very much, exciting, and so I invite your interest. These were not, the purpose here was not to hide the often actually demonic content, but I didn't really want to hide it. This was my first book published by Penn State University Press. And then the second one was about a fully encrypted manuscript, the Rohon's Codex. It's several hundred page long, entirely enciphered codex. The book is published again by Penn State University Press, which is not very far from, actually not very close. I just checked on the map, it's not very close. And here I argued that this is not enciphered. It's believed to be the second most mysterious enciphered manuscript after the Voynich manuscript, but it's basically not enciphered. It's more a perfect language, an artificial language that the author of which didn't want to hide. He just wanted to practice his artificial language on a religious text, which can be approved, but it was not obvious for many years. And then finally, I wrote my monograph, which was published by Amsterdam University Press for just for change, in which I try to carry out this social history of cryptography. Okay, what did I do? First, I was concentrating on the technology they were actually using. I tried to figure out the key sharing methods and the frequency of this key sharing. I wanted to identify those persons who actually did the practice of cryptography. I wanted to compare to what extent secret messages were decrypted as compared to just acquiring the key, just tormenting the messenger and telling him that, give me the key. It's much easier, actually. What mistakes were made, what misunderstandings, what reproaches users of cryptography made to each other, how outdated the methods they were using were. And I managed to point out that the methods were actually very, very good methods, but they used them on a completely outdated way. They just didn't make full use of these methods, and the low-level practice of early modern cryptography is often due to the fact that the scribes were lazy. The methods that they used were high-quality methods, but the scribes were lazy. Then knowledge transfer. Cryptography manuals were available on the bookshelves, but they didn't really use it. These manuals contain all kinds of sophisticated, fancy methods, but the actual methods used, the monoalphabetic and the homophonic methods, I'm not going to explain them, but they are easy to understand, were different. And it seems that the source of this practice was basically diplomacy, not these very good high-level sophisticated manuals, not even the Arabic textbooks. We have very good Arabic textbooks from the Middle Ages, but they were unknown at the time, and not even the artificial languages. Artificial languages also have a beautiful story, but most of the methods were just taken from diplomacy, and that's the almost exclusive source of knowledge transfer. Then, how can we integrate the practice of cryptography into other practices of secrecy, like dissimulation, like political and diplomatic secrets, military operations, emotions, private correspondences, scientific, alchemical, magical content? How were women involved in all this practice, and how in the religious texts cryptography was used? I brought up examples for all of these. I'm not going into details, I'm just mentioning that. And I argued that this approach is extremely helpful because in the 16th, 17th centuries, basically in the early modern times, social and political situation, purpose, cryptographic knowledge, and the use of those tools of those using cryptographic methods were considerably more diverse than previous literature, which focused primarily on diplomatic practice, had shown. Some examples. I'm quite okay. A few examples. Some of these authors use cryptography for strange methods. The first one is poet Bálint Balasi, who was actually the first poet writing in Hungarian. Every primary school boy knows his name, but this sentence is somehow not really quoted. Not because it was encrypted, because you can decrypt it easily, but because somehow this is not part of the curriculum. The second guy had a diary, and he encrypted just a few sentences, mainly when he was drunk, and he wanted to document that. I was drunk and behaved in a way I should not have. I promised not to drink wine for a month. 2 days later. This is how long I could go without wine. Drunk, feeling sick. All this is encrypted. And the last example is when a merchant has, again, a diary, and when he realizes that his guest and his wife cheated on him, his wife was pregnant actually at the time, then he encrypts these parts. But these are easy to decrypt, either because very low-level methods are used, or because the key is attached to the diary. So why? For what purpose do they use this method? Not really to hide something. Georg Zimmer argues that secrecy and shame are often related. So when you are ashamed of something, you don't want to advertise it very much, but still you want to document it in your diary, then you might use cryptography. Then, as I already mentioned, there is a huge gap in the practice of cryptography and in its actual possibilities, but I will skip that part. And I just show you a few examples. I pointed out that the very same key was used for correspondence from very different cities between very different people. And you see, the system becomes fragile if you use the same key in all directions. You can solve these methods much easier. This is actually a high-level homophonic table in which you have more equivalents for every letter and specific equivalence numbers for frequent words. It's very hard to solve such a method. But if you keep using the same methods in different directions, then it's easy. Again, if you start all your letters with the same words, even though you use different equivalents for them, after a while, the code breaker will compare them. The same with the date. The date is always a break in point where you can attack the system. That's why clever scribes do not encode the codes, because the dates, because you will know it in any way when the letter was sent. Okay, and there are all those funny correspondences when people blame each other. I was unable to read your letter. We got the letter, but we don't know which key to use. We got the key, but this key doesn't work. Which key should be used? And once someone writes back, was this written in a cipher, or is it just in Polish? Sometimes the handwriting cannot be read. Your witch-like writing causes an awful puzzlement. You wrote about so many things, as we've spelled out one, we forget the other. It has a start somehow, yet in the end it becomes like the bulls let loose on the hillside. At another case, I cannot figure out what did you write, knives, goats, or sturgeons? In Hungarian, actually, kés, kecske, kecsege look more or less the same, but it's not the same if it is a knife or a fish, right? Not to mention goats. Okay, yes, there make mutual reproaches. I skip that, and cryptanalysis I skip again, and this one I already mentioned. Rather, I get here. We expounded the whole project, and it's a multinational cross-disciplinary cooperation. I'm there, actually, an earlier version of mine is in the corner. And we deal with whole Europe. And we not only collect material, but also try to transcribe it with automatized methods and decrypt them. This transcription is the real challenge, HTR, handwritten text recognition. This is the greatest challenge. This is a truly cross-disciplinary cooperation, or I would rather use the expression digital humanities. This is really digital humanities, I believe, because it's not only history and linguistics and computational linguistics, but also cryptology, computer science, image processing, math, and everything, archival studies. We put together a huge database. It's open access, actually, 10,000. There are 10,000 records, cipher keys, and encrypted text in this database, with all kinds of metadata. Then the historical corpora in 17 languages from the early modern times. That was put together by other scholars. We just imported them, and we can use them when we want to decrypt the specific texts. And the transcription, now this is the problem. We are not Google, we are not OpenAI. Unfortunately, we are not as successful in segmenting and recognizing handwritten elements, but we try to improve. And then there is, again, an open access software for decryption. If you want to play with it, you can download it. It takes a half an hour to learn how it works, but it's very nice to play with historical texts. Linguistic corpora are integrated into that. So if you want to solve secret messages, then you can easily do that. So I'm not sure I really did what I decided to do 15 years ago, but I'm still enthusiastic about this topic, and I hope that I could prove that writing the social history of everyday people who actually practiced cryptography makes sense. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Láng, for that, which was not merely a presentation of these new tools, but also a sort of manifesto for future research. I want to introduce our second and last speaker for this panel, is my colleague Christopher Atwood from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, who will be answering the question, actually, what's secret in the secret history of the Mongols?
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone. I especially thank Julia and the other organizers for organizing this wonderful conference, which has been quite enlightening and amusing so far. How do I move the thing forward? Okay, great. All right. The most important history of the Mongol Empire has come down to us with an odd name. It's the Secret History of the Mongols, or Mongolian Notes Tovchan. The title appears, however, only in a late 14th century Chinese transcription and translation. The work in its original Mongolian language format has been lost. So readers and scholars have wondered, was this the original title? And if so, what exactly was so secret or notes about this history that it became the Secret History of the Mongols? So unfortunately, given the loss of the original book format, and even actually about two-thirds of the text is preserved in Mongolian, but most of the text, and usually what is seen as the sort of base text for critical study, is a version that was transmitted only in Actually, I'm going to jump ahead. I suddenly realized I should probably put a picture up just so you can see. You can actually see what this is, kind of what it looks like. So it's all in Chinese, but their columns, some of the columns are transcribing the Mongolian syllable by syllable. So Chinggisi Haha no Hujaor, which doesn't mean anything in Chinese, but it sounds like Chinggis Khan Ujor, which is the Mongolian word for the origins of Chinggis or Genghis Khan. So that's the usual basis of critical study. There is, as I mentioned, there is in fact a Mongolian version, but it's less complete and less satisfactory, actually. By placing this work in its original historiographical context and considering what passages in it might have been considered so secret, several potentially sensitive issues do emerge. Whether it was the embarrassing details about the family history of Chinggis or Genghis Khan, precise counts of the numbers of Mongol soldiers or partisan interventions into the succession struggles, weighing the precise ramifications of secrecy illuminates how information was controlled in the Mongol Empire, and particularly, this will getting towards this solution for the answer to my question, how social status governed and ethnic status governed the distribution of knowledge. So first, just to introduce the work, it was written in 1252, which is 25 years after the death of Chinggis Khan, and about 15 years after the last main narrative event of the work. It's also 1 year after a coup d'etat in which one branch of Chinggis Khan's descendants, those descended from his youngest son Tolui, seized power from a different branch of Chinggis Khan's family, those descended from his Chinggis Khan's third son Okade. This will prove to be somewhat significant. So I first would like to look at some of the issues what are the issues that are secret in the Mongol Empire? There we go. So here's an interesting example. This is from a authentic chronicle of the great founder. The great founder here is Chinggis Khan for the year 1226 and 1227, in the year of his death. Now, this is from a later history that succeeded the Secret History of the Mongols. I sometimes call it the Secret History of the Mongols' little brother, because it was kind of produced on the basis of the Secret History of the Mongols, but is in many ways actually much more of a public chronicle. It eliminates almost all the private sort of family information. And here's the last 2 years of Chinggis Khan's life. In Bingshu, the dog year, 1226, in the spring, he reached Kashin, which is or also known as Tangut, place in northwestern China. Within the space of 1 year, he sacked all its cities. In Dinghai, the pig year, 1227, he destroyed this kingdom before returning. It doesn't mention that he returned as a corpse. He actually died in 1227 and then returned to Mongolia in a coffin. So there seems to be some taboo on the name, and we see this in other sources as well, some sort of taboo on mentioning the death of the Khan, so death of some person. And this kind of taboo is also related to the famous taboo or secrecy of the place of burial. There's many stories that non-Mongolian authors tell about this secrecy. This is an interesting story. I won't read it here, but you can read it. It's sort of so many trees grow up in that place that it becomes secret. This is actually a version which is almost certainly coming from a Mongolian source, albeit in Persian translation by Rashid ad-Din. Even the guardians of the tomb place don't know actually where it is because it's such dense forest. Oh, excuse me. So here's another interesting example, and this is getting a little bit to the secrets of the Mongols. The Persian historian Rashid ad-Din is speaking of the family of Chinggis Khan's eldest son Jochi and his three brothers, the younger brothers Tagade, Ögedei, and Tolui. And he writes, there was constant strife, quarreling, and disagreement between Jochi and his family and his brothers Tagade and Ögedei, slightly different spellings. And because of blank, the path of unity was trodden upon both sides between him and Tolui, the youngest son, and his family. And none of them ever uttered that taunt, but regarded his blank as genuine. What's the blank? Well, the blank here is, as we know from the secret history of the Mongols, if we didn't have the secret history of the Mongols, it might be a little bit puzzling. The blank here is his birth. They regarded his birth as genuine. In other words, they regarded him as a legitimate son of Chinggis Khan. So talking about the ancestry of some other person, of some member of the imperial family, their possible illegitimacy, was definitely a matter of secrecy in the Mongol Empire. Another one, there seems to have been the number of Mongol soldiers is also an area of secrecy. After describing registers of soldiers, this is from the Yuanshi, which was a post-Mongol empire compiled immediately after the Mongol Empire in 1370 on the basis almost entirely of Mongol Empire era records. And they say that even the ministers associated with the Privy Council, who were closely associated and exclusively in charge of the armies, only one or two of their chiefs knew the actual number of soldiers that there were. It's military secrecy. It also adds an interesting ethnic element here. The Han people, that's to say the people of North China, were not allowed to peruse the figures of the army, even though some of them did serve in that military function. So for 100 years, nobody knew exactly how many soldiers they had, which is kind of interesting because there are many figures that are presented about this in other sources. And in the secret history of the Mongols itself, there's actually an interesting reference to a kind of military secrecy. The guard system of the Mongols is a very famous system called the Kishikten. And in that guard system, the Mongol was more than just an actual bodyguard. It was actually kind of a central command. It encompassed scribal functions, hunting, military expertise, and so on and so forth. But one key group was the ones who guarded the Chinggis Khan while he was sleeping, or other Khans as well. They all had their own guards. While they were sleeping, and they were the night guards. So let no one ask the number of the night guards. And if you ask the number of the night guards, then that person will be seized together with the horse he rode in on. I like that, the hell with you and the horse you rode in on, and your saddle and bridle and the clothes you're wearing. So that's also something that you can't ask even, which is very funny because the secret history of Mongols will actually tell you that. So there's also historiography within, there's also secrecy within the tradition of historiography itself. And this is a famous passage from the introduction to a 1304 or so compilation by Rashid ad-Din, famous Persian historian. He was also a high official in the Mongol court. And he describes here, I won't read the whole thing, he describes here what he saw as the situation of Mongolian historiography. They have these secret histories that are authentic history in Mongol expression, unorganized, disarranged, scattered in treasuries, hidden from the gaze of strangers and specialists, and no one is allowed to access it until he, Rashid ad-Din, was commissioned by the Mongol Khan in the Middle East, Mahmud Ghazan Khan, to take these original histories and sort of turn them into something. It became the famous Jamia Tavari, or the Compendium of Chronicles. And so this is also, the secrecy here is also part of his claim, Rashid ad-Din, his claim to authority as a writer. His history is accurate because he got high clearance, high security clearance. And that's because he's was presumably a great guy and very trustworthy. Similarly, in the Mongol Empire successor state in China, around, we have this interesting description in a biography in which Qinghai, who was an early associate of Chinggis Khan and his son and successor Ögedei Khan, Qinghai is the writer of this biography, probably around 1350 or so, is talking about how distinguished Qinghai was, and he says basically, there's a dynastic history called the Toftian. It is most secret. If you have no merit in the imperial founding, if you didn't do some big thing to help found the Mongol Empire, you will not be recorded in it. His honor's name appears therein. So obviously he must have had great merit. So again, what the secrecy is kind of interesting here. One of the things you'll notice that Topchan is, which is the same word for history, is also the word that's used in Secret History of the Mongols, but nothing about Qinghai appears in this. So this is not a reference to the secret history. This is a reference to some other history. So, and finally, we also have in the 1330, the emperor commissioned a Han Chinese scholar and a Turkic scholar who was kind of, his status was rough, sort of honorary Mongol kind of status, to compile comprehensive statutes for administering the age, Jingshi Dadian is the Chinese. And they were supposed to get a copy of this history book. But the academician Yatboka, and the name is a Turkic name, but it's probably a Mongolian figure. The Topchan history concerns court secrets. It's not something that can be circulated in writing to outsiders. Your servants dare not accept the edict. In other words, he had been ordered by the emperor to give access to these two historians to some of this stuff. And he says, Emperor, I'm not going to do it. And he's backed up, and that's it. End of the story. So there's a lot of secrecy within the historical process, and we can't say that all of these secret things are in fact the secret history of the Mongols. In fact, other histories were also secret. So that's one part of the puzzle. Another part is we have this is as I showed you, this is the actual manuscript. And so here you can see actually where the word secret history of the Mongols comes from. So first part about it, we have here Yuan Chao Mishi, and this is the Chinese title. It is today to this day the usual title of this work in Chinese. Yuan Chao Mishi is basically Secret History of the Yuan Dynasty. Now, the Yuan Dynasty was the Chinese-style name given to the Mongol dynasty in China. So that's what we have there, and that's the main title. And this, by the way, is in the original 12-chapter version of it, which was probably produced around 1380s, again, about 20 years after the fall of the Mongol Empire. They were actually using this as a language textbook, so which is kind of funny. But here's in the orange down there, that below that is again, this phonetic transcription. Mongolian, if you read it, it's something like Mongolun Niocha Topchian, which is Middle Mongolian-ish, sort of in a Chinese transcription of Middle Mongolian from Mongolian Notes Topchang. That's the modern Mongolian, which is the secret history of the Mongols, or of Mongolia, or of the Mongol state. Again, Mongolia is a little ambiguous in that regard. So that's the 12-chapter version. But later on, they took the same text and redid it in 15 chapters. And so there we see, again, if you look up at the top right, looks vaguely similar, that's the Secret History of the Yuan Dynasty. But there is nothing, that transcribed Mongolian Notsutavchan is not there. So this 15-chapter version felt free to omit what was a transcription of this Mongolian. Does that mean that it wasn't actually in the original? Again, it's a little bit unclear. So yet at the same time, so what we can say is that the Chinese translators, when they translated it, thought the secrecy of this text was one of its primary features. But at the same time, we're not sure that was actually originally in the Mongolian. If I had to guess, I'd say it probably was. Maybe it was, but one cannot be absolutely sure. So let's look at what's actually the secret in the Secret History of the Mongols. Well, so there's a couple of events here, and again, I give you the text. You can read it. One of these episodes is that Chinggis Khan and his younger brother, they kill, as a teenager, basically, he killed his half-brother Bektar. And there's a story about this in the Secrets of the Mongols, and it also tells about Chinggis Khan's mother who, by the way, was not the mother of this half-brother, is scolding him and calls him, you're like killers, you're murderers, you're like a python that swallows its own young, something like, and you're like a falcon that goes again, attacked its own cliff. It's a nice poetic passage, which is rather lengthy, so I didn't put it in here. But here we have and it's interesting, Bechter just sort of sits there and accepts it. So he kind of accepts his death as maybe as some kind of sacrifice for the good of the state. Anyway, it seems to be, and he says, don't extinguish my hearth, don't forsake Belgutai, don't kill my other half-brothers. There were two half-brothers. And Belgutai later does go on to become a significant, important figure in the ruling class of the Mongol Empire. This story is nobody else, apart from the Secrets of the Mongols, no other source that I've ever seen actually from the Mongol Empire ever tells this story. The very name Bechter is no longer there. So this was, in fact, absolutely top secret, this story. So there's another one, Baramburta Wujin, that is the translation, that is the name of Chinggis Khan's first and primary wife, the mother of all four of his sons who were considered potential legitimate successors. There were other sons, other wives, but their children were not considered legitimate. So here we have a story that, again, you can kind of read it. It's a story told from the perspective of an old servant woman in the family, Granny Hokjin. She goes out and they get raided by the Merkit. They capture Madame Berthe, and they do this in revenge for the fact that Chinggis Khan's father had captured a woman from their family, from their people previously. So it's a revenge seizure. And then she is taken, and she then spends quite a while in the in the family of this guy, Chilgur the Brawny, the one who had previously, the one who had previously had, the brother of the one who had previously had his wife stolen. There's another version of this one. And in this one, yes, she got captured, but she was instantly sent to the court of the patron of Chinggis Khan. And he was very chivalrous and said, I could not take her because Chinggis Khan, or Temujin, he was called then, is the son of my good friend, Yusugay Batur. She's like a daughter-in-law to me. And he sends her home. He is then, and then while she is on the way home, she gives birth. And that's why he's called Jochi. Now, Jochi in Mongolian means guest. And so he's a guest because he's just suddenly appeared. Other people would later say things like he's a guest because he's actually not actually in the family. And that gets to the succession debate. So later on, as Chinggis Khan is dying, the Secret History of the Mongols tells this story. Tagade, Chinggis Khan's second son, has heard that Chinggis Khan is thinking of appointing Jochi as his successor. And so he says, how could we be governed by this bastard foundling of the Merkit being the people who had seized Chinggis Khan's wife previously. In other words, he sees him, Jochi is not Chinggis Khan's son, he is the son of this Merkit character. And then they start fighting each other, and they're grabbing their collar, and it's getting very physical. And Chinggis Khan starts listening. Eventually, in the Secrets of the Mongol story, they basically say, Chagate, don't ever mention that about Jochi again. It was rough times then. It doesn't actually say it didn't happen that way. It says it was rough times. Things are different now. You're just insulting your mother by saying this. Just chill out. And so in the end, Chinggis Khan appoints neither Tagade nor Jochi. He appoints Ogedei, his third son. But the succession debate, a typical version, this is from Joveni, another Persian historian. I could quote similar versions from Chinese sources. Most of the other versions are kind of like Chinggis Khan decides which one of his sons is really the best on the basis of their character. Ogedei, the third son, he should ascend the throne of the Khanate. my place because he stands out among you for the excellency of his firm counsel. And all the sons just bow down and say, yes, who could who hath the power to oppose the words of Chinggis Khan, and who the ability to reject it? So it's all presented in the other ones as this, nobody's grabbing each other by the collar and, wrestling in the presence of Genghis Khan in anger over the whole thing. So that's definitely something the Secret of the Mongols is quite secret about. Or Genghis Khan. Now, interesting, Genghis Khan's death, other sources, this question of sort of taboo on mentioning death is an interesting question. But other historical sources, they all do mention that Genghis Khan died. What's interesting about the Secrets of the Mongols is they mention actually literally what actually made him sick. Other sources just say he got sick and then he died, and you can see there on the in the other sources. But in the Secrets of the Mongols, he was hunting the Timan Kulons, or wild asses of Arbucha. He was riding on Red Earth Grey, that's the name of his horse. When the Hollands came on, Red Earth Grey was terrified, and Genghis Khan fell from his horse, and his flesh was deeply damaged, and he pitched camp at Chorgat. So he fell off a horse. That's, again, nowhere else mentioned. So finally, in the end, Secrets of the Mongols goes into the reign of Genghis Khan's successor, Ogedei, and it ends with his 4 faults. And so we have this error of, Ogedei says, basically, I was alcoholic, and that's widely acknowledged. Says, I took over the girls of Ochigin, the elder uncle's kingdom. So basically, these were women for the Khan's harem. He did a gathering of them. And this is mentioned elsewhere in other sources, except they say, just so you think, Ogedei was generally seen as being a nice guy compared to his father. They say, just don't think he's too nice. He did this, and they resisted, and he punished the people from Ogedei, from his uncle's kingdom. There's also something about Doholhu. This was a commander who got defeated, and then it says that he was secretly killed by Ogedei in the Secrets of the Mongols. Other sources don't record this. I've got an article about that. And finally, this walling off, creating walls that would sort of funnel animals towards this. This is mentioned by other sources as simply one of Ogedei's many great public works. So it's not quite clear if these things are secret or if there's just a very different evaluation being given. There's also, Secrets of the Mongols records 95,000 of Genghis Khan's men. And Rashid ad-Din, the Persian historian, also mentions the number, 129,000 individuals. So maybe these aren't current. Maybe these are recording past numbers, so that's why it's okay. But they are recording the numbers there. And similarly, the number of night guards, again, both the Secrets of the Mongols records 10,000 night guards. And elsewhere, the Uensher records 14,000 night guards and then 1,000 individuals. So you're not supposed to ask their number, but there's a number written down. So is this really secret? All right. So the conclusion, what is really secret in Secrets of the Mongols? I would argue, so based on these, some things certainly are secret, but it's not clear that there's any one super secret that makes this the secret. And I would argue that maybe the whole question really is not so much one of specific things, but as general audience. The colophon, or the succeeding statement to the Secrets of the Mongols, says it was compiled when a great Khurultai was assembling in the Roebuck moon of the year of the mouse. Now, there's a large scholarly literature on what year of the mouse it was. I say it's 1252. There's debates on that, but we'll just go with that. But what's interesting is the Great Khurultai, and who can participate in a Great Khurultai? Well, for 1228, it describes these people, basically the princes of the left hand, sons of Genghis Khan, princes of the right hand, brothers of Genghis Khan, princes, princesses, sons-in-law of the center, and commanders of the 10,000s and thousands. These are military ranks. That's the definition of the ruling class of the empire. That's the definition of people who can participate in a Khurultai. And presumably that's the definition of the people who are allowed to hear this history. So and what you may notice is that at least at this time, essentially all of these people are Mongols. They're all in the Mongol imperial family and in the new ruling class of high commanders created by Genghis Khan. So perhaps that's why it's the secret. But the irony of this, to just include, the irony of it is that the Secret History of the Mongols during the Mongol Empire period was, as I said, we do have that it was used as a source for other histories, but we have no, it certainly was not publicly circulated. It only circulated within this, we could say, Mongolian ruling class. But it became the standard account now at this point. After the fall of the Mongol Empire, and it was transcribed into Chinese, that circulated. Eventually, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Secret History of the Mongols was rediscovered, and it became the standard account. But remember, the history was written, or at least first drafted, in 1252, 25 years after Genghis Khan's death, and 15 years after the last major episodes recorded. And it was drafted, as I said, right after a coup d'etat in which Tolui's line seized power. Now, the interesting thing is Tolui's line seized power with the help of Jochi's line. But there's other evidence from the time that the Toluid line didn't really appreciate being helped by the Jochid line. In fact, the Jochid line, that line of Genghis Khan's first son, who was suspected of being a Merkit bastard, as it says, that Jochid line was kind of overbearing. And so the Toluid line appears, there's a lot of evidence that Toluid historians outly respected the Jochids, all the while engaging in this very sly sort of preterition. Do not pay attention to those who say that Jochi was not legitimate. You should never pay attention to that, and I hope you don't think that. So they're kind of putting that in there. But what's ironic is in the 20th century, as Benedek Láng has shown, the family episodes are becoming the center of Genghis Khan's history. If you watch a movie about Genghis Khan, produced after, say, 1990, the family episodes that are only in the Secret History of the Mongols will be central. They will be maybe explained away or dealt with in some ways, but they will be central. But the problem is that it's actually not at all clear that they are anything other than sort of gossip within the family. So in other words, we tend to naturally assume the secret history tells us the true story because it's discredited, it's lively, it's family-based, and it's secret. But in fact, the actual historical accuracy of these family stories is really in no way attested and is not corroborated by other sources. So we kind of have a problem. It's secret, but is it true? Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, for that fascinating presentation. We have 10 minutes for questions before we break for lunch. There are 2 microphones circulating. Great, if you would please. Professor Bertucci.
My question is for the first speaker. I'd like to know if cryptography, the history of cryptography in the early modern period and earlier is limited to texts, or whether there is a cryptographic tradition that extends to the visual. I'm not here interested in Kabbalistic images, alchemical illustrations, so the kind of emblematic tradition. That's not what I mean. I really mean deliberate transmission of visual knowledge that is ciphered and can be deciphered with a key.
And still it's not related to texts. It's non-textual. There is steganography, There is steganography, which is the hiding of the message. Invisible inks, for example, that can be decrypted if someone knows that we have to decrypt it. Steganography is a much safer thing than cryptography, even today. But this is not what you meant. Then please rephrase your question.
Really, images.
Just images.
Yeah.
But hiding messages in images is steganography. Even today, that you have to relate this and this and this points, or these points are relevant and those points are not relevant. And as I said, it's much safer. So if you want to, you want to participate in any conspiracies, don't use cryptography, because the National Security Agency will recognize that something is going on. whereas stenography is hiding the very fact that I'm contacting you, and it's much safer. No one notices. There is no visible way. But other than that, I can't think of anything. But I have a question. May I abuse this position? I have a question to the second topic. This is a very far example, but the archives in the Vatican are called the secret archives of the Pope. And here, secret doesn't mean secret. It means the private. It was the private collection of the Pope. And I know that the Vatican is very far from Mongolia, but I'm wondering if secret has this connotation of family or private, or is it a good analogy?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and in a sense, I'm kind of pushing towards that position. But I think simply from what I know of the word, its connotations, its usage is still widely used, but it's also used in Middle Mongolian. It really does seem to be just also secret. I mean, right now, top secret in Mongolian is mashnots. That's the same word. But even in Middle Mongolian as well, I don't think it has that word of private. So there is some sense the title itself does carry the idea of this is something that is not to be known, not just something that is private.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your fascinating talks. I have a question to Professor Atwood. I'm wondering if this practice of secrecy is present in other historiographies of Mongolian Empire.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there does seem to be a sense, we have this interesting statement that there are these topshans or chronicles that contain things about Qinghe, certain people that are said to be secret, or Jermi in Chinese, which means sort of like top secret, actually. And yet we know that that's not the secrets to the Mongols because it doesn't even have that information. So there does seem to be a general tendency towards secrecy of the history. So in that sense, one could say all the secret histories of the Mongol Empire, written in Mongolian at least, are secret histories. Which would mean, in some sense, that it's a little bit odd that the name is called Secrets of the Mongols, because that would apply to others. But we also do know that there are, at least after about 1300, there was both in the Mongol successor state in China and the Mongol successor state in the Middle East or Iran, there was, we could call, sort of a controlled release of information. And certain amounts of pieces of information did become known, but without fully releasing it. So what's interesting about Rashid ad-Din, for example, is a Persian historian from writing around from 1304 to around, probably continuing work on it up to about 1310, is that there's a lot of all this information, and yet there's also clearly much of the secrets to the Mongols' secrets are still not revealed. So it's a release of information, but it's a controlled release of information that doesn't expose everything. And so that is that makes the 14th century somewhat distinctive compared to the earlier, the 1200s, when almost all of this family information was not known to non-Mongols.
David, our colleague here, and then Ayako.
Can you hear me? I have a quick question for Chris as well. I got the sense from your talk, and so forgive me if I misunderstood, that a lot of the non-secret text that you were juxtaposing to the secret history contain much of the same information, except for little bits that are missing, little key bits that are missing. So it was really hard to escape the sense that many of these other texts are either modeled on the secret history or vice versa, and that, in other words, the secrecy is only for very small little nuggets of data within it, which raises the other question of what really does it mean for it to be secret? Is it secret in the sense that you can't see it, or does it mean that it's secret that you're not allowed to touch on certain aspects of it when cribbing it for information for your own history?
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say. In a sense, yeah. So there is, I think, and I guess, and I'm kind of actually, I think that the approach to secrecy changes over time. As I mentioned, in the 13th century, there does appear to be a wider, more extensive secrecy of whole sources. I would also say that again, it is pretty clear, and I did some work on the genealogies of the secrets of the Mongols compared to the genealogy that Rashid ad-Din, for example, this Persian writer using Mongolian sources uses. And my conclusion was that there's no evidence that he used the secrets of the Mongols genealogy. He used a number of other genealogies. So in that sense, I do think that it's unlikely that he probably ever actually saw the secrets of the Mongols as an actual text. Again, we don't really know if it was around in the Persian Iran, the Mongol Iran at the time, but assuming it was, he probably didn't see it. On the other hand, yes, it does seem to see that after 1300 in the 14th century, the approach was not to keep the whole story secret. The approach was to a controlled release and make sure everybody understood, again, like those little blanks in his history, they never uttered the taunt about his blank being genuine. And so everybody understands everybody understands what cannot be said. At the same time, though, there are a couple of whole stories that are simply nowhere. So, for example, again, the killing of Bekter, this is just absolutely verboten. I mean, it's nowhere, anywhere in the sources. Another one that's kind of interesting is there's a 1340s author who is comparing the Mongol conquest dynasty, the Mongol non-Chinese dynasty, to the previous Khitan and Jurchen non-Chinese dynasties. He says, unlike them, our Mongol dynasty he's trying to say our Mongol dynasty is better, but those previous barbarian dynasties are illegitimate. And like, we don't have ridiculous stories in our great Mongol dynasty's origins about being born from some animal or something like that. But they have ridiculous stories like that. Now, if you actually read The Secrets of the Mongols, you know that the genealogy begins with a blue wolf and a fallow doe. Now, it's actually Rashid ad-Din, this Persian author, just transcribes blue wolf. It's Burtachan. He treats it as a name, but it means blue wolf. I mean, is this like sitting bull or something like that? It's hard to say. But in any case, the fact that he literally confidently said, no, our great Mongol dynasty doesn't have any animal ancestries in it at all. I have a feeling if he had any knowledge about Burtachan and this gray wolf and fallow doe, he would not have been, so he would just avoided that point entirely. So yeah, basically after 1300, yes, it's a very careful process of regulating access rather than some sort of, for most of it, blanket prohibition.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for both excellent presentations at this panel. And I have two short questions to Chris. One is about coming back to the title issue. So was it because in contemporary sources, it's usual that the same text is known under various titles, so they are title variants as well.
Yeah.
What was the case here with the secret history? And my other question is about the reception. Of course, we know that it has a unparalleled significance and influence in modern scholarship as well. But can you say a couple of words about the impact or the reception of the text right after its creation? So,
okay, yeah. So first, about the title, you're probably right. There were probably variants. There's no way to know. There's no possible way to know. As I said, even the one that we use that is usually used, was it the Mongolian Notes of Chan? Maybe, possibly. I think likely, but I can't even be certain about that. So unfortunately, I can't really answer that first question. As for the second, again, so the Secrets to the Mongols was, putting it very briefly, I would say the reception history goes a little like this. It was produced in 1252. It was probably shared with a fairly wide body of the Mongol elite, that is to say, members of the Chinggis Khan family, the sons-in-laws, and the high commanders, the sort of hereditary commanders of thousands, which is 1,000 soldiers and so on. It then, and it probably did, we have traces of earlier histories that can actually be reconstructed. And what we can say is that the Secrets of the Mongols changed the story in a number of different ways. For example, they moved the center of Mongolian history from the area that's now around Karakorum to the area of what's now the Onan-Herlin area, which is further to the northeast. And it also changed. Earlier, the idea was Chinggis Khan was a kind of provincial character who succeeded by overthrowing the ruler in central Mongolia, Ong Khan. The Secrets of the Mongols changes that. No, Chinggis Khan was part of the lineage that was always the true ruler of Mongolia, and Ong Khan in central Mongolia was just another ruler, and he replaced him, but that was his line conquering Ong Khan's line, not him getting on the seat of the central Mongolian Khan. Those changes appear to have been then incorporated into Mongolian historical understanding. After 1260, all of the other sources that we have incorporate that understanding. And they do that through, under Kublai Khan, he, again, edited the Secrets to the Mongols to produce this authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan, which then was used by Rashid-ud-Din and so on. But so the Secrets to the Mongols had this covert influence that was exercised through this other much edited version of it, and much revised, in some ways much more accurate, certainly for sort of political and military history. And then it just kind of continued that way. Again, sometime after the fall of the Mongol Empire, the Secrets to the Mongols came up, and so that's roughly the story of right after the empire. So
Ayako has been very patient for her final question.
Final question for Professor Láng. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating talk. That slide with the diary, secret diary entries, really caught my attention, and I was wondering, in that moment, the meaning of secrecy, the meaning of using encryption, it felt like, is this really the same as when you're trying to send a diplomatic message secretly? It seems like maybe hiding, shame is a word you used, hiding something from oneself using encryption. I thought if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I fully agree. I think the purpose is completely different. Whereas in diplomacy, the purpose is to exchange information on an everyday basis, quickly, and usually, not always, but usually high-level methods are used that are hard to decrypt. Here, the purpose might be just to hide the information from someone who is just peeking over just opening secretly the diary and having a look. This person cannot read these sentences, but those can read them easily who have some time. And that's why I came to this explanation of Georg Zimmer, who was a German philosopher and who wrote about secrecy in the beginning of the 20th century. And he says that secrecy is very often related to shame, when we sort of want to hide something, but not very much. It is working in us. We fight somehow with this thing. Because, well, we could just do that. We don't write it anywhere, and then it's really hidden. But we fight with this, and that's my explanation for these examples. But it's completely different in the case of diplomacy. And exactly my argument is that there are so many different purposes cryptography can be used, not only systematic hiding of diplomatic information. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you to both our presenters.